Well, good afternoon. Our speaker today is Dr. Ray Murphy. He is Emeritus Sociology at University of Ottawa, past president of the Environmental and Social Research Committee of the International Sociological Association, and we're happy to say he is a member of the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. Started an honors B.Sc in physics, but by the time he did his PhD, he'd migrated to sociology. Authored multiple books, you can read them. Mainly I'm looking forward to it. The Accelerating Treadmill of Fossil Fuel Practices and Assessing What to Do About It. We know about the, over to you, Ray.
Okay, I guess I'm okay to go now.
Go now.
Okay, thanks, Zach, for the kind introduction. And I want to thank the organizers of KCOR as well for inviting me to do this presentation. Dr. Syukuro Manabe, who won the 2021 Nobel Prize for Physics by developing predictive models of the Earth's climate and reliable forecasts of global warming, concluded that, and I quote, "Figuring out the physics behind climate change was 1,000 times easier than getting the world to do something about it," end of quote. My presentation examines why this is so and seeks to contribute a practical understanding of the drivers of the increasing carbon concentration in the atmosphere involved in human-caused climate change. It attempts to answer the question, why are fossil fuels still stuck at over 80% of the global energy used, despite the impressive rollout of wind and solar energy and increased efficiencies? These drivers consist largely of the accelerating treadmill of fossil fuel practices humans enjoy or need. Such a practical understanding is a necessary condition to get them to do something about climate change, particularly through voting practices in democracies, although time will tell whether it is a sufficient condition. As I was putting the finishing touches on my latest book entitled The Fossil Fuel Climate Crisis, Foresight or Discounting Danger, question mark. The question mark is important. The coronavirus pandemic exploded. Let me start with a quotation from Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and co-chair of the independent panel of the World Health Organization investigating that pandemic. And I quote, "We have to bear in mind that with a highly infectious pathogen like this, we're living in the 21st century where it can be on the next flight. We're not living in medieval times where it traveled on foot or by donkey," end of quote. The pathogen now travels efficiently and rapidly in human hosts by fossil fuel propelled cars, planes, cruise ships, and the like. Unlike donkey travel in medieval times, an outbreak anywhere on the planet now threatens to rapidly become a pandemic everywhere. Similarly, invisible greenhouse gases causing climate change are emitted by the next flight in the 21st century. They were not caused by people traveling on foot and by donkey in medieval times. Humans have changed their relations with nature's dynamics, which is resulting in a different, more threatening natural environment for humans. Technological and market innovations have increased the threats of pandemics and climate change. Past successes in ensuring safety can no longer be extrapolated as a reliable guide to the future. We're still, and now I want to share my screen. Share screen, okay. Okay. We're still, a significant disjuncture has emerged between fossil fuel practices like aviation and the cultural assessment of their long-term danger or safety. I keep hearing people say, my flight couldn't possibly change the planet's climate. Safran Foer stated that, and I quote, "Most of us would find it difficult to explain how our individual and collective behavior is boosting hurricane winds by almost 30 miles per hour or contributing to a polar vortex that sometimes makes Chicago colder than Antarctica," end of quote. To place that point in a Canadian context, Most Canadians do not understand how the aggregated emissions from their pleasure drives across the country, jet fuel tourism, cruises, social media streaming, and supplementing prosperity by the high emissions practice of extracting oil from bituminous sands have contributed to the wildfires and floods in British Columbia. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are imperceptible to the senses. They can only be accurately measured by scientists, who then communicate the global quantity of emissions causing climate change in gigatons. But non-scientists rarely understand the relationship between these scientific findings of global danger and their own fossil fuel practices, nor do they understand the scale of humanity's fossil fuel practices. The 4 billion passengers flying annually assume their own fossil fuel flights have no more effect on the planet's climate than if they were in medieval times traveling on donkeys. The material energy powering social practices has changed from donkeys to fossil fuels, but cultural beliefs concerning safety haven't changed. The acceleration of fossil fuel activities, even over 2 generations, has been enormous. Compare our generation's fossil fuel practices with those of our grandparents. We drive more, fly more, cruise more, cremate more, use more energy glutton social media servers and air conditioning, have more cement buildings, and there are more people engaging in fossil fuel social practices. Yet we assume our own practices cannot change the planet's climate. Is it any wonder that populations refuse to accept a price on carbon emissions anywhere near what is necessary to mitigate global warming, even though they want the climate problem solved? A refusal Pilke calls the iron law of climate change. Ignorance of the scale and consequences of practices is why many resist carbon taxes as a government money grab, or do not change their fossil fuel practices despite carbon taxes. Why should they pay more or sacrifice those activities if they have not contributed to causing the problem? Make someone else pay or sacrifice. Technologically, humanity has developed into the jet fuel age. Culturally, it remains stuck in the donkey age. This has to change to have any chance of mitigating the climate crisis. My objective here is to contribute to a practical understanding for non-scientists of the causes of what the IPCC aptly calls human-caused climate change. By practical understanding for non-scientists, I am referring to their comprehension of the consequences of specific fossil fuel practices and of the scale of those practices. I will present a different type of emissions gap report, one that investigates the gap between the population's fossil fuel practices and their cultural assumptions concerning those practices. I will examine the gap between understanding the harmlessness of one individual engaging in those practices and lack of understanding of the enormous cumulative harm that results from the aggregation of 8 billion humans doing them year after year. Fossil fuel climate change is a physical problem. Nevertheless, it has socioeconomic causes and consequences, and if it has solutions, they will be socioeconomic ones. This presentation will therefore translate the science of global warming into everyday units applied to normal activities to make the source of the threat more meaningful to non-scientists. Natural science didn't shy away from revealing the depth of the threat of global warming, and neither should social science. That is the foundation of adequate solutions, even if, in both cases, decision makers and populations don't like to hear how deep and extensive the problem is. Since the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels have provided the energy for most of the social activities people engage in to meet their needs and do what they enjoy. They have been tremendously beneficial, but they also have perilous side effects when combusted, particularly emitting greenhouse gases that cause global warming and climate change. People have to understand how deeply the source of the problem is embedded in everyday practices. They may be motivated more by positive, hopeful, and inspirational messaging about opportunities, increased safety, and sustainability. Nevertheless, a practical understanding of danger is the necessary foundation for hopeful messaging, especially to avoid being misled by wishful thinking. As Homer Dixon put it, and I quote, "If hope is to be a motivator and not a crutch, it needs to be honest and not false. It needs to be anchored in a realistic, evidence-based understanding of the dangers we face and a clear vision of how to get past those dangers to a good future." End of quote. The focus is on fossil fuels because they are the most significant single causes. Moreover, fossil fuels underlie almost every other environmental problem. Deforestation on the scale it is now occurring would be impossible if two men had to cut each tree with a manual saw, then hitch it to a horse, drag it to a river, and float it down to a sawmill, as in the pre-fossil fuel age. Without deforestation, biodiversity loss and species extinction would be much less. Depletion of fishing stocks has been caused by fossil fuel boats and equipment. Loss of agricultural land and wetlands has been powered by fossil fuel machinery. Fossil fuels power the expansion of meat eating, the making of cement, and thereby enormous concrete structures, the growing popularity of cremation, and human population growth. In 2009, a fascinating debate occurred between prominent geologist David Hughes and prominent economist Mark Jacquard. Hughes argued that peak fossil fuels constitutes the greatest problem for modern economies and ways of life because the energy and costs needed to find, extract, and transport new, remote, technically difficult sources is approaching the energy return. Net energy is shrinking. Jacquard argued, on the contrary, that as scarcity approaches, prices of fossil fuels increase, exploration and innovation increase. Therefore, supplies of fossil fuels increase. Thus, the principal problem is the increase in combustion, resulting in greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. The main carbon sink that developed over millions of years before humans evolved is underground, which could be referred to as safe carbon storage. But since the Industrial Revolution, societies have been digging and pumping carbon out and emitting it into the atmosphere and oceans. These have limited capacities to hold carbon without causing harmful consequences of a greenhouse effect, global atmospheric heating, and ocean acidification. This could be called peak carbon sink of the atmosphere and oceans. The Hughes-Jacquard debate occurred just before high oil prices incentivized the innovation of hydraulic fracturing, greatly increasing the supply of inexpensive natural gas and tight oil. Cheap gasoline then led to a surge in the popularity of heavier vehicles, such as SUVs and pickup trucks, and higher emissions. Figure 1 shows that the emission of heat-trapping gases of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere grew very slowly until fossil fuel practices increased at the time of the Industrial Revolution around 1850. And since then, it has grown exponentially. It has gone from harmless donkey-powered transportation to harmful greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuel practices. Figure 2, showing the sources and sinks of carbon dioxide, demonstrates that before 1880, little carbon was extracted from underground and emitted into the atmosphere. But now, after 2015, huge amounts are. Carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere over a century and accumulates, causing a greenhouse effect and global warming. Emissions compared to carbon withdrawal from the atmosphere determines whether global warming worsens. In figure 3, NASA documented that if greenhouse gas emissions were stabilized at today's rates, shown in green, global warming would get worse, and that emissions have to be not just reduced, shown in light blue, but decreased to withdrawal rates to stop warming. Decoupling economic growth and growth in emissions will not mitigate global warming, but recoupling emissions and carbon withdrawal will. What are the human causes of emissions? It is essential to take into account greenhouse gas emissions generated by both a relatively small number of enormous polluters and an enormous number of prosperous, relatively small polluters on the individual, organizational, and country levels. Take fossil fuel vehicle practices. Nobel laureate William Nordhaus states that if he drives 100 miles in his car, and I quote, "I consume 5 gallons of gasoline. This will produce about 100 pounds of carbon dioxide, which will come out of the tailpipe and go into the atmosphere. I can't see or hear it or smell it, and I generally do not even think about it. If I'm like most people, I will probably assume that my trip will have no effect on the world's climate, and so I will ignore the consequences." End of quote. Non-scientists likely assume Nordhaus is wrong because 5 American gallons of gasoline only weigh about 31 pounds. Where do the remaining 69 pounds come from? They come from oxygen in the air during combustion. Each atom of carbon combines with 2 atoms of oxygen, which has a heavier atomic weight, making the carbon dioxide emitted about 4 times heavier than the gasoline. Non-scientists need a practical understanding that the carbon dioxide they emit is much heavier than the fossil fuel they use. Moreover, if one person drives once, little carbon dioxide is emitted. But the average car will be driven about 10,000 miles each year. So it will emit about 10,000 pounds of carbon dioxide annually. There are almost 1.5 billion cars globally, increasing to 2 billion by 2040. The global fleet of cars is presently emitting 15 trillion pounds of carbon dioxide every year, which remains in the atmosphere a century. Emissions are coming disproportionately from wealthy countries, which have 90 cars per 100 population compared to 3 per 100 for poor ones. The scale and proportionality of fossil fuel practices are the important issues. Consider fossil fuel aviation practices. Lifting a 40,000 kilogram plane with its 20,000 kilogram load of passengers, crew, and cargo, and its 18,000 kilograms of jet fuel, then powering it to fly at 800 kilometers per hour and landing it requires the combustion of those 18,000 kilograms of jet fuel, hence emitting an enormous quantity of greenhouse gases. In 2019, there were, on average, just under 110,000 commercial flights per day globally. Note that 80% of the world's population have been excluded from ever flying due to cost. Yet, 4 billion passengers fly annually. Aviation practices are monopolized by the remaining 20%, disproportionately by frequent flyers. Even among those who fly, there is an unequally structured appropriation of the atmospheric commons as a carbon dump, causing global warming. Swiss researchers affiliated with ETH calculated the emissions of flights between cities. A short return flight between London and Nice results in 438 kilograms of carbon dioxide per passenger in economy class, roughly 5 times the weight of an average 90 kilogram passenger. It is 568 kilograms in more spacious business class and 1,100 kilograms in most spacious first class, respectively 6 and 12 times the weight of the average passenger. The carbon dioxide from these 2 hours each way of flying remains over a century in the atmosphere, causing a greenhouse effect. The next figure shows the accelerating treadmill of commercial flights increasing at about 7% per year. Aviation grew from 4.5 trillion passenger kilometers in 2009 to 8.3 trillion in 2018, with all the emissions that entails. The United States Department of Energy predicts that the global demand for jet fuel will grow from 160 to 106 billion gallons in 2019 to 230 billion in 2050. Flying is one of the most emissions-intensive activities people engage in, but they act as if it were as harmless as traveling on donkeys. The short flight between London and Nice in a small private jet of the wealthy emits almost 10,000 kilograms of greenhouse gases. There were about 22,000 private jets, many big ones, in operation in 2020. One study found that, and I quote, "The private jet market is currently undergoing unprecedented demand. Both charter and ownership demand is soaring. The average number of global daily business jet flights is around 11,500 flights per day in 2021, end of quote. Private jets add an enormous and increasing amount of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. The United States military is the world's biggest single institutional consumer of hydrocarbons, and therefore the largest institutional carbon polluter, with the Air Force surpassing the Army and Navy. The increase from one war to the next has been huge, reflecting ongoing innovations in military mechanization. The combustion of fuel was on average 1 gallon per American soldier per day during the Second World War. In the Vietnam War, it increased to 9 gallons per soldier per day. And in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it rose to 22 gallons per soldier per day. In 2015, the American agency responsible for military energy dealt with 14 million gallons of fuel per day, with all the emissions that entails. The growing demand for electricity is undermining the transition to clean, renewable energy, because the default option for electricity generation remains fossil fuels. A significant cause of demand is the swift development of information and communications technology, ICT. That includes networks, production of ICT, televisions, computers, mobile phones, and data centers, which require electricity for functioning and cooling. In the 30 years from 1987 to 2017, the traffic to and from data centers grew from 2 terabytes, 10 to the 12 bytes, to 1.1 zettabytes, 10 to the 21st. If the growth of computationally intense cryptocurrencies continues, this will increase far more. Ultra-efficient ICT is replacing less efficient ones, and some data centers recycle waste heat to be used for nearby purposes, and some have been relocated to colder countries for natural cooling. Nevertheless, the overall emissions due to ICT has not decreased because of the rapid increase in traffic. For example, emissions due to data centers rose between 2014 and 2020, despite major improvements in efficiencies, because their workloads increased far more. Information and communication technology is now responsible for 2% of emissions globally, about the same as the aviation industry's emissions from fuel. It needs to make a rapid transition away from fossil fuels to zero carbon energy. In the United States, Netflix accounts for 1/3 of internet traffic. Netflix reported that its fans clocked more than 6 billion hours watching its 10 most popular shows in the 28 days after they were released, resulting in emissions equivalent to 1.8 billion kilometers driven in cars. The streaming site YouTube had 1.4 billion users in 2016, emitting 11 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and it certainly has increased since then. There has been a 20% annual growth in efficiency, but that did not lead to lower emissions because there has also been a 50% annual growth in demand for capacity. In 1958, 4% of Americans were cremated. 60 years later, in 2018, over 50% were cremated. In Canada, the rate of cremation rose to 74% in 2020. The average cremation consists of combusting about 28 gallons of natural gas, propane, or diesel to incinerate the corpse for about 2 hours at 1000 degrees Celsius, reducing it to about 3 pounds of ash, thereby emitting 540 pounds of carbon dioxide. Although the corpse is gone after 2 hours, almost 3 times its weight of greenhouse gas is emitted into the atmosphere where it remains for hundreds of years. There were 244,000 corpses cremated in Canada in 2020, adding 132 million pounds of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And this is only Canada, and just one of many additions to the accelerating treadmill of fossil fuel practices. Most likely people are not aware of the greenhouse consequences of cremation. If they were, hopefully they would insist on having it powered by green electricity or choose aquamation like Desmond Tutu. The practice of taking a cruise has grown exponentially over the past several decades, with 30 million people taking a cruise in 2019, crisscrossing the oceans, and cruise ships increasing in size. The quantity of energy these huge floating hotel restaurants use not only to propel them, but also to provide 24/7 amenities, air conditioning and heat, lighting, entertainment, meals, is enormous. This energy invariably comes from fossil fuels, typically the cheapest, most polluting type, namely bunker fuel or diesel. A cruise ship carrying 2,500 passengers combusts about 80,000 gallons of fuel a day. Its tank holds between 1 and 2 million gallons. Cruise ships are of different sizes and travel different distances, but an estimate based on the carbon dioxide equivalent emitted by all cruise ships in 2017, divided by the number of passengers that year, shows that they emitted 820 kilograms per passenger, or almost 10 times the weight of the average 90-kilogram passenger. And that estimate should be doubled because passengers have to fly to the departure port and from the destination back home, with all the jet fuel emissions that entails. Passengers exit the cruise ships within a couple of weeks, but the carbon dioxide their crews emitted remains in the sky over a century. Their enormous carbon emissions are largely invisible, out of sight, out of mind. The COP26 conference was big and caused too many emissions, which should be reduced by doing much of it virtually. But shouting hypocrisy at COP26 participants solves nothing. It and academic conferences are a small part of the climate impact of conferences generally, particularly the many huge international business and technology conferences and trade shows. An informative case is the following. Educators in virtual reality replaced their in-person international conference in 2020 with a virtual one, then hired an expert to calculate the difference in emissions. The comparison demonstrated that the in-person conference would have resulted in 7.7 million kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions, which is 1,542 kilograms per participant, 17 times the weight of the average participant. Whereas the virtual one resulted in less than 125,000 kilograms, or 25 kilograms per participant. In-person networking is useful and enjoyable, but emitting almost 7.6 million more kilograms of carbon dioxide for a 6-day conference is a high price future generations will have to pay for it. 90-year-old William Shatner, better known as Hollywood's Captain Kirk, the Star Trek hero, flew 10 minutes in a return flight to space aboard billionaire Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin. He commented on how tiny the Earth's atmosphere is, a mere sliver, and how vulnerable it is, adding, everybody in the world needs to do this. At present, only billionaires and celebrities are doing this. But space tourism for the wealthy could become another addition to the accelerating treadmill of carbon polluting practices. How much pollution and what types depends on the propellant used, and it includes not only carbon dioxide, but also soot and ozone layer depleting substances. The per passenger pollution for the 4 passengers aboard during Shatner's 10-minute flight was in tons. When real astronaut Chris Hadfield tried to justify space tourism, all he could think of was that it is not worse than a cruise ship. This is a case of the pot calling the kettle black. And space tourism does not replace cruises. It adds another set of emissions. If some practices need to be declared non-essential and sacrificed to mitigate human-caused climate change, space tourism monopolized by very wealthy people would be a prime candidate. In 2018, efficiency gains decreased greenhouse gas emissions per passenger in planes by 7%, but global aviation traffic increased by 7% too, nullifying decreased emissions. Efficiency of most fossil fuel technology is improving, but the more efficient it is, the more people use it. Efficiency as a solution to global warming can in this way be self-defeating. Figure 4 shows that emissions per GDP can decrease, the decreasing yellow line, yet because of economic growth in GDP, emissions can remain high and even increase, the horizontal blue line, which worsens global warming. It is absolute emissions compared to carbon withdrawals that determines whether global warming is worsening or being mitigated. Despite efficiency gains and implementation of non-carbon energy, mitigation is being undermined by the accelerating treadmill of innovating new, attractive fossil fuel practices. Humans are running faster, innovating efficiency and green energy just to stay in the same place of emissions. Hence, the proportion of fossil fuels remains stuck around 80% of overall global energy use. The atmosphere and oceans constitute commons everyone shares, including future generations, but they are being appropriated as waste sinks to dump carbon. They are media that carry social relations of monopolization and exclusion from risk makers to risk takers across space and between generations over time. Benefits are disproportionately garnered by some, but consequences are disproportionately suffered by others who are or will be excluded from most benefits. The economist Stern has characterized monopolization and exclusion in space as, and I quote, "Poor countries are least responsible for the existing stock of greenhouse gases, yet they are hit earliest and hardest by climate change," end of quote. The sociologist Beck expresses monopolization and exclusion in time as, and I quote, "Issues of climate justice include the excluded non-living future generations who are going to suffer most because the atmospheric carbon sink is filling up," end of quote. The human causes of climate change must be specified without descending we are all sinners rabbit hole that says everything but nothing. Proportionality of greenhouse gas emissions by individuals, companies, and countries must be central, as must the understanding of scale. In my 2021 book, I am applying an analysis of monopolization and exclusion I published in my 1988 book to the contemporary monopolization of the atmospheric commons as a carbon dump and the exclusion of latecomers, namely future generations and the poor, from using it that way. The more fossil fuel gluttons combust, the less carbon sink capacity is left for latecomers. They will have to either suffer global warming or drastically reduce their fossil fuel practices because early polluters have monopolized the limited space in the atmospheric and oceanic dumps. Early birds to the fossil fuel golden age cannot claim it is exclusively reserved for them. Hence, it is important for early birds to recognize the harm of legacy emissions and lead the transition away from fossil fuels. The Anthropocene involves not just the impact of human activities, as usually stated, but more precisely, monopolization of the planet's resources, particularly the atmosphere and oceans as carbon dumps, by the fossil fuel extraction and combustion practices, agricultural practices, and deforestation practices of high-consuming humans. This can be clearly seen with respect to loss of biodiversity. monopolization by humans results in the destruction of the habitats of other species, which is an especially devastating form of exclusion, leading to high rates of human-induced extinction. The scale of fossil fuel practices is enormous and continues its rapid growth, thereby undermining impressive advances in clean energy. That is the bad news. Now for the really bad news. The treadmill of fossil fuel practices is now accelerating faster. This involves two drivers. First, the intensification of fossil fuel practices in affluent countries and by the affluent in other countries. And second, the transition to fossil fuel practices in developing countries. Developing countries and the poor are jumping on the same trajectory that affluent nations have been on, or are aspiring to that trajectory. Mao promised a bowl of rice on every Chinese table. And even in the 1970s, pictures coming from China showed everyone pedaling bicycles, which resulted in little carbon pollution. By 2021, 400 million prosperous Chinese are feasting on meat, driving cars, and participating in jet fuel tourism, like the prosperous everywhere. The remaining 1 billion Chinese are aspiring to those fossil fuel activities. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are well advanced on this trajectory. The huge populations of India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, and others are latecomers to this fossil fuel indulgence, but are striving to enjoy the same activities. Since 2021, under Xi, the Chinese military has leaped on the accelerating treadmill with more powerful fossil fuel carbon-emitting machines of war. So has Russia under Putin, and developing countries are rapidly acquiring them. Unlike wind and solar energy, fossil fuels have huge long-term environmental costs, particularly costs of hurricanes, biodiversity loss, and eventually sea level rise. Studies have attributed the 2021 drought, fires, and floods in British Columbia to climate change, and therefore their massive costs. These costs are excluded from the price of fossil fuels and are treated as free externalities. Stern argues that, and I quote, "An externality arises when the action of one person or company or country directly affects the prospects of another. Emissions are clearly an externality and thus a market failure," end of quote. Fairbrother states that, and I quote, "An externalities-based view of environmental degradation emphasizes not just that pollution and resource use have costs, but that polluters and resource users over-engage in pollution and resource-using activities specifically because they burden others with some of the costs of those activities rather than themselves," end of quote. Had carbon polluters been forced to pay the costs of their emissions, there would be less pollution. These unpaid costs of fossil fuels accumulate into an environmental debt in the form of long-lasting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, resulting in ongoing extreme weather and costly disasters. This will be paid belatedly by victims. Failure to pay its full costs at the time of use results in carbon-polluting energy being cheaper than low-carbon energy, thereby incentivizing carbon pollution. Low prices for fossil fuel activities have high costs for global warming victims. The bigger the fossil fuel users, whether they be individuals, industries, or countries, the more they are subsidized by victims. Nordhaus argues that, and I quote, "Those who burn fossil fuels are enjoying an economic subsidy. Allowing firms to put carbon in the atmosphere cost-free is a valuable subsidy. It is the right to harm others. Policies to slow climate change are economically simple, if politically difficult. They involve raising the price of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and harmonizing the price across countries," end of quote. Economists argue that the least expensive, most effective way to reduce emissions is to incorporate the full costs of fossil fuels into their price. Full cost would include a carbon tax or certified offsets based on estimates of the cost of long-term damage from carbon pollution, or of paying for pulling an equivalent amount of carbon out of the atmosphere by natural or technical means. Instead of high oil and gas prices being incentives to extract more, imposing a price on carbon pollution in proportion to its quantity would provide funds for mitigation and adaptation and push companies to innovate new low-carbon technologies and prompt consumers to exercise restraint on fossil fuel activities. Imagine the offsetting funds from private jets and the military. One problem with this solution is that increased energy prices often incite rebellions, especially by the poor who pay a higher proportion of their income on energy, usually fossil fuels, such as by the yellow vest in France. This can be avoided by sending part of the money to the poor so they would not be worse off, but do it in ways that still give them incentives to use low emission energy. The more powerful opposition will likely come from fossil fuel producing companies and countries, the military, the wealthy, and the prosperous, who will see increased fossil fuel prices as downward mobility, restraining their activities like flying in private jets, jet fuel tourism, cruising, driving, etc. Human-caused climate change is a wicked problem because a culture of entitlement to cheap fossil fuels has developed. If environmental economists are correct, any other solution will be more costly, entail more sacrifices, and be less effective. The alternative presently practiced is to let future generations suffer the consequences. Regulations are another way to reduce emissions. They constitute undermining an industry's entitlement to pollute, pollution which had been externalized and paid in terms of harm to the health of citizens or to the environment they need. Thus, regulations consist of a downward redistribution of wealth, promoting a more inclusive sharing of environmental benefits, even between generations and between those distant in space. Conversely, deregulation and failure to regulate pollution increase the capacity to monopolize wealth by externalizing costs. They involve an upward redistribution of wealth. Much like wealthy polluters struggle against taxes, they fight environmental regulations that reduce their capacity to monopolize wealth. The first action of Donald Trump was to deregulate the coal industry, allowing it to become more profitable. Canada's bitumen industry was investigated in my book. Bitumen is found in tar sands that contain the world's third largest oil reserves. Exploitation requires extraction from sand, upgrading, and transporting it long distances from its remote locations. Thus, it results in high emissions type of oil, a type becoming increasingly prevalent as wells are depleted. A pattern of phases discounting danger was found, and a hypothesis was proposed that it is common to the exploitation of all valuable but dangerous resources. This was studied by examining the phases traveled by that same country concerning its world-leading reserves of asbestos, which was at first heralded as a needed fire retardant and insulation resource. In the 1930s, books were written about the upcoming age of asbestos, and residents where the largest deposit was located proudly named their town Asbestos. However, the harm asbestos caused was confirmed by medical science and translated into a practical understanding of danger. That prompted lawsuits and regulations to limit its use and incited the innovation of technological alternatives. The massive asbestos reserves are now left safely underground, but only after a century-long struggle and enormous harm. The region and country adapted and are now more prosperous. Will the same outcome occur for bitumen and all fossil fuels, or will the phases be longer and more arduous, the consequences more severe, and the end stage different because of the greater importance of fossil fuels? Time will tell. Scientific assessments of risk cannot be communicated to non-scientists by presenting complex computer models. A practical understanding can be communicated to the population by analogies. The crucially important concept of emissions exceeding carbon withdrawals as the cause of the climate crisis can be communicated through a bathtub analogy. If there are more emissions than withdrawals, then carbon accumulates in the atmosphere, causing a greenhouse effect. Much like water accumulates in a bathtub, if the faucet lets in more than the drain removes. Mitigation is equivalent to turning down the faucet. If that is not done, the tub overflows and people have to forever mop up the mess. This is similarly true if excess emissions continue, thereby increasing the global temperature of the atmosphere. The analogy shows that adaptation becomes more difficult and costly if mitigation is done too slowly and insufficiently. My book also investigates messaging strategies for the danger of climate change, which Beck awkwardly called staging. One type of messaging involves frightening book titles, such as The World Without Us, published in 2007, 7 Years to Save the Planet in 2008, Requiem for a Species in 2010. Flannery's 2009 book was entitled Now or Never, about mitigating climate change. 6 years later, he tried positive messaging and published Atmosphere of Hope, focusing on opportunities. But neither fear nor hope motivated emissions reduction because people don't understand how emissions are caused by fossil fuel practices. To extend Homer Dixon, to be motivating, hope and fear need to be anchored in evidence-based understanding of the causes of danger. Note that my goal is not to scare people. Rather, it is to inform them about the scale and harm of fossil fuel practices. If that scares them into changing those practices, including voting practices to support carbon taxes, so be it. My book then turns Beck's staging framework right side up by analyzing the staging of discounting the danger of fossil fuel climate change. This includes staging of faith in future just-in-time market-driven technological miracles, of fossil fuels as poverty reduction, of mitigation as a job killer, of blamelessness, and of climate change fossil fuel critics as hypocrites. To avoid costs and sacrifices, there is often reliance on imagined future technological fixes to create just-in-time solutions when problems become sufficiently serious. This faith-based belief legitimates present fossil fuel practices and discounting danger. Since technological success is uncertain, this amounts to faith in the unforeseeable. It is necessary to underscore the importance of distinguishing between hoping for technological remedies and relying on such solutions because society refuses to change its fossil fuel practices. The book distinguishes two types of technological climate fixes. One would mitigate global warming while enabling fossil fuel use to continue, such as carbon capture and storage and geoengineered sunscreens in space. Presently, these fixes favored by the fossil fuel industry don't work or are too expensive or dangerous. The other type would innovate alternatives such as solar, wind, hydro, tidal, geothermal, and nuclear energy, and leave fossil fuels safely underground. These also need substantial technical improvements, for example, emissions-free jet fuel. Paying for these innovations and making clean energy competitive require including the full cost of fossil fuels in their price through proxies like carbon taxes and certified offsets, instead of them being cheap because victims pay belatedly. Thus, the book assesses the polluter pays solution. One way of paying the full cost of fossil fuels is through requiring mandatory certified offsets of emissions. This is particularly relevant for aviation, where there is no foreseeable technological alternative to fossil jet fuel. Presently, the costly long-term damage caused by combusting jet fuel is not paid by flyers and airline companies, but instead belatedly by victims, including future generations. All plane tickets constitute discount airfares by discounting the cost of their jet fuel damage. The Swiss researchers estimated how much offsets would add to the cost per passenger. For the short return flight between London and Nice discussed previously, this would increase the price of plane tickets, but not excessively, as shown in red, if spent in developing countries like Kenya instead of wealthy ones like Switzerland. Mandatory offsetting 4 billion tickets yearly would provide much needed funds for mitigation, adaptation, and researching clean technologies. The present system of voluntary offsetting has failed to reduce emissions because ecological saints are rare. They offer token payments rather than the full cost, and the worst polluters don't pay. It doesn't satisfy the principle of scale and proportionality. In market societies, consumption depends on price. Therefore, fossil fuel activities increase when they are cheap and decrease when their price includes their full cost. If victims distant in time or space are forced to pay the environmental debt, then the cost to polluters is invisible, much like carbon dioxide is invisible, and polluters believe there is no cost and pollute freely and abundantly. To correct this, enforced offsetting and carbon taxes must be paid by all in proportion to their carbon pollution. Living in society requires controlling personal choices that harm others, such as emitting greenhouse gases. Therein lies the challenge, unpleasant as it is to hear. Freedom requires acting responsibly. Unmitigated acceleration of fossil fuel practices runs up against the climate harm it causes. This constitutes limits to growth of fossil fuel powered activities. As a recipe for disaster consists of remaining in the donkey individualistic culture whereby individuals ignore science, scale, and proportionality and believe their fossil fuel practices do not contribute to climate change. If this continues, resulting in the refusal of effective carbon taxes and offsets, then the future looks bleak. Not only will there be more costly extreme weather, but also belated prevention of fossil fuel climate change will require draconian sacrifices by future generations. If, on the contrary, people have a practical understanding of the dangerous consequences of fossil fuels, then I'm hopeful they will do the right thing and pay their full costs instead of leaving the environmental debt accumulated to be paid by their grandchildren. That understanding is necessary to comprehend that paying upfront brings long-term benefits. Reconfiguring taxes and offsets to make polluters pay could turn around scale and proportionality from enemies of mitigation and adaptation to friends by providing resources to support them. Payments of carbon taxes and offsets that diminish the unfair price advantage of fossil fuels will wither away as clean technologies are innovated to replace carbon polluting ones. The sooner emissions are restrained, the lower the costs of preventable fossil fuel damage and of the environmental debt. Oil producing countries typically feel threatened by climate change mitigation. However, there is one country that is as good as it gets for an oil-producing country, namely Norway. Its oil can be pumped directly from the North Sea and is relatively close to European consumers. Hence, it is low cost, and its easy extraction and transportation make it the least carbon-intensive type of oil. When it was discovered, foreign oil companies wanted to exploit it. So the Norwegian government demanded very high royalties to maximize benefits for Norwegians, over 70%, and the majors walked away. Hence, the Norwegians formed State Oil to do it themselves, albeit more slowly. The majors realized they could still make a profit and accepted the high royalty rate. The profits from State Oil and high royalties from other countries yielded a huge sovereign wealth fund. It was invested mainly outside Norway to avoid inflating its currency and hurting Norway's ability to sell its goods to other countries, which was called the Dutch curse. Norwegians understood that combusting oil contributes to climate change. So Norway paid and is paying offsetting to Brazil and Indonesia to protect their rainforests. This succeeded remarkably well until Bolsonaro came to power in Brazil. Within Norway, The government introduced high taxes on new car purchases, on gasoline, on parking, and toll roads to provide money and incentives for electrified public transportation. When electric vehicles were introduced, taxes were waived on them for purchases, parking, and toll roads. The result is that Norway's electric vehicle fleet is far greater than any other country. Only 8% of new cars sold run solely on gasoline or diesel. Curiously, Norway borrowed the idea of sovereign wealth fund from Lockheed's Alberta and state oil from Pierre Trudeau's Petro-Canada. Norway's population empowered its government to implement taxes and regulations in the interest of all its citizens, which includes a clean atmosphere for this generation and future ones. The result is prosperity and a small country with the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds to be used when oil runs out. Alberta, on the contrary, bet on attracting foreign investment by low royalties and taxes and companies' freedom from government regulation. The result is boom and bust oil price cycles, a tiny sovereign wealth fund, and no money paid to offset its carbon pollution. My book also examines other cases where mitigation of fossil fuel climate change succeeded through carbon taxes, feed-in tariffs, coal industries transformed into prosperous wind energy industries, Nordic social democratic and California's successes, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and more. However, climate change is worsening, which shows that mitigation needs to be quickly scaled up globally. When activities become powered by clean energy, they can be enjoyed by future generations, meaning our grandchildren in perpetuity. This is the hopeful scenario based on a practical understanding by the population of the harm of fossil fuel activities. My book, The Fossil Fuel Climate Crisis, Foresight or Discounting Danger, ? And this presentation seeks to contribute to this. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but more importantly, I want to learn from your expertise. So I hope my presentation will spark a lively discussion. Thank you, Zach.
Hi. Well, thank you. Hang on. Yeah, I'm not muted. Thanks very much. There are several questions. Meg Sears has a comment. If you want it to be a question, that's fine. If not, ask another one. Or at any rate, Bill Reese has comments also on Nordhaus, which I was kind of expecting to happen. Somebody to comment on that. So Meg, would you unblock your camera and unblock your mic? You're muted. There you are.
Okay, third time clicking, I'm lucky. Thank you very much. It's fascinating. I was just commenting that there are so many ways that you can just do without and be just fine. And so I just made the comment that you can be retro green by, instead of having all of the IT, you can listen to the radio on the radio, and you can watch TV using an antenna and completely miss all of the Google tracking and everything else. You can do it in your own privacy of your living room or whatever. But actually, I think that all of this IT really does represent a lot of energy, not only for the data centers, but for the transmissions and all of the satellites and getting them up, and then the rubbish coming down, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering if you would mind just commenting a little bit more about the IT, Internet of Things, et cetera, how you see that fitting in with climate change. Because some say, well, we need that so we can have smart cities and save energy by, with smart traffic lights or something like that. But I'm not 100% convinced on all of this.
Ray, do you have an answer for that?
No, but that's a very good comment, very interesting comment. I'm a little bit skeptical that people will go back to radios and things like that now that they've experienced all the IT. I think the main solution is to make a transition of the electricity supply into clean energy, because it's going to be very hard to turn back the clock and get people to do without all these things that have come out. That's the usual way that emissions are increased, because companies invent all sorts of very attractive products. And so I think it's really crucial that we base their power on clean energy. So it seems to me that is the way out that I see, rather than trying to get people just to abstain from using them.
Do you see that there is going to be enough clean energy without having a huge amount of reduction in energy use?
It's a big problem. I don't know. It's also a question of getting the clean energy quickly and everywhere, which is a huge problem. So I think at one point, Bill Reese made the comment in one of the sessions I looked at that he's willing to bet $100 that the problem wouldn't be solved. Bill can correct me on that one, but I'm hopeful that humanity will solve this problem, but I don't think I'd bet my $100 against Bill Reese. He might be right, but it's a wicked problem. As I said, it's a really difficult problem.
I'm going to send this over to Bill Reese. You're up next anyway, and you can answer that.
No, Ray, you're absolutely right. I didn't make that bet, and so far no one's taken me up on it.
Yeah.
So I think I'm on pretty solid ground there. There's certainly a role for so-called clean energy, but we're going to have it in much lower quantities than we're used to, and it's certainly not going to come on time. If you think of having to reduce fossil emissions by 50% in the next 8 or 9 years, there's no sign whatsoever anywhere in the world that the pace of clean energy displacement can achieve that goal. And by the way, I mean, I know a number of climate scientists quite intimately who would say there's no possibility whatever that we're going to maintain temperatures within the 1.5 degree limit. That's long past. Everything else one hears is rhetoric, and some doubt that even 2 degrees is possible at this point. Which brings up, by the way, I suppose the point I was trying to make there about William Nordhaus, who is really quite infamous in this domain, because at one point he argued that climate change was not a big deal because it would be impact agriculture mainly. And since agriculture is only 3% of GDP, it would only take 1 or 2 years of growth at most to overcome the impact of climate. Kid you not, this is what we're talking about here. So I've often wondered why it is that we don't ask ecologists to comment publicly and to write op-eds about unemployment and economic growth and a variety of things that fall into the economic domain. And yet, whenever something comes up that requires enormous expertise about biophysics and climate dynamics and ecosystems dynamics, we always go to economists. It's just an astonishing, to my mind, sleight of hand. Even the COP meetings don't feature climate scientists. It's mostly government policy advisors who tend to be economists who know absolutely nothing about the physical dynamics of the systems that they're dealing with. I guess that's about all I'd read. Oh, one other minor point. I loved your points about full cost accounting, because I think this really is a key to so much that we've been discussing on this line. The problem is, Ray, that I don't think climate change is the big issue. It's a symptom of overshoot, which is a bigger issue. And you mentioned many of the symptoms of biodiversity loss, land use changes, and all of these things, which are uncosted, unpriced in our economy. And if we were to apply your framework, which I think is extremely well articulated, a full cost pricing across the board, not just to fossil fuel use, then we would find that most of our goods, certainly all our luxury items, would be priced right out of the market. We simply couldn't afford almost everything that we take for granted as luxury goods today, from televisions to computers and telephones. The full cost accounting would
I'm going to jump in and say I've always worried that a full cost accounting for carbon would be very difficult to do. I mean, how do you express the value of the end of civilization
Exactly.
or humans? You know?
Anyway, it's theoretically wonderful. It's conceptually what we need to do, but in practical terms, I think it's not going to happen. And I'm very concerned that we're headed for a darker future than most people are willing to contemplate. Anyway, I loved your talk. Thank you very much, Raymond.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a whole series of comments because you made all sorts of good points. And now if I can all remember them all, my responses. First of all, Overshoot, William Catton, his student Riley Dunlop is somebody that I've worked with quite a bit, and I know about Overshoot. It's a very important, path-breaking book that Catton wrote a long time ago. I'm just wondering though, when you talk about economists, I hope you realize there are economists and there are economists. There are different kinds of environmental economists, and that goes in even within the Nordhaus family. I hope you're not confusing William Nordhaus with Ted Nordhaus, his nephew, because Ted is in the Breakthrough Institute. I could easily imagine him saying something like you just said, but William Nordhaus, if you look at his book about the casino climate change, I can't remember the exact title, he is the one that's really certainly enlightened me about full cost accounting. And that's basically what he is proposing. And coming to just to respond to Zach there, of course, you can't put a cost on the end of civilization. But what you can do, and I suspect that that's what the researchers at ETH, which is basically the MIT of Switzerland, did, instead of trying to calculate all the damage that fossil fuel costs over next 100 years, which is impossible, basically, you can try to make an estimate. These things are approximations and estimates of how much it would cost to pull out of the atmosphere an equivalent amount to what is being put in by that plane, for example. And I think that's the way they are doing it. And they make all sorts of deductions. They calculate, they attribute some to passengers, but then the cargo in the plane, they attribute that to the company and the employees' seats, etc. But I think there are some ways of doing that, that kind of estimate for full cost accounting. And I think it's a good way of thinking of things. It should get more publicity in terms of the full costs of fossil fuels and a practical understanding by the average person, rather than the people just thinking, oh, my plane has my ride in the plane has no effect on the environment. Anyway, those are just a couple of comments that I have on what the interesting comments you made.
Whole bunches of questions have shown up in the chat. Peter McKinnon, your hand is up. Are you there?
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Ray, that was a very interesting presentation with lots of facts into it. But one of the things I didn't hear much discussion of, or any discussion of really, was your views anyway on nuclear power as one of the sources of green, if you like. And also in that context, if you could divide it between sort of the traditional large nuclear power plants and the modern format of, say, small modular reactors, which are, as you're probably well aware, made in a factory kind of environment, but are yet to be commercially deployed. So I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you. I enjoyed your talk.
Okay, I don't rule out nuclear power as some environmentalists do. I think it has a place, not in Japan where there are earthquakes, but perhaps if you want to transform the tar sands from the dirtiest form of oil to one of the cleanest in terms of emissions, well, why wasn't it powered by nuclear power from the beginning? Because everybody knew it had a huge amount of oil and could last a long time. Anyway, but the point I wanted to make though about nuclear power, I just want to get my figures down right, because I did look in that in my book. There's a researcher called Pielke, and he calculated that the elimination of 1/2 of the global fossil fuel emissions by nuclear energy between 2010 and 2050 would require, that's 1/2, 12,000 additional regular sized nuclear reactors, namely operating one every day. And the cost of nuclear reactors is enormous and usually goes way over budget. And constructing all these nuclear reactors would still leave humanity dependent on fossil fuels for the other half of the energy needs. In other words, we got to reduce the fossil fuel practices somehow, or the practices that require so much energy. But this is a problem, not just of fossil fuel, of nuclear power, but of almost any alternative. The question of scale is crucial. For example, some people have proposed the natural solution of seaweed to withdraw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then you store it at the bottom of the oceans. Okay, sounds good. The problem is emissions are so high that the seaweed farms would have to cover 9% of the world's oceans, or half of the Indian Ocean. And then the stuff would need to be processed continually and permanently. So the moral of this story, it seems to me, is we really have to reduce our fossil fuel practices somehow, not just find alternatives. You know, right now, we're doing an impressive job of rolling out green energy, solar and wind, etc. But at the same time, we're always rolling out new fossil fuel practices that require more and more energy, and the default option is fossil fuel energy.
Thank you.
I know that one of the options has always been to think of augmenting a great deal of nuclear power with a great deal of the other renewable power that is good, but it's only a viable part of the day, sort of thing. Have you thought of that?
Yeah, but I think, like, you know, where there's sun, sometimes there's wind. Where there's wind, where there isn't sun, there's wind. When there isn't wind, there's sun. And also, if you have it over a much larger surface, then you can, there might not be wind in one area, but there'll be wind in another. There are some ways of reducing, of dealing with this problem, but it's no magic solution. I agree. There has to be some other ways of producing base load and things like that. But I think we really have to have clean energy scaled up quickly.
Well, okay. Jumping back, Ray Lou, can we take your question to me offline sometime? But John Hollins, I think you're next.
Thank you. And thank you, Zach, for running the show and helping Art out. Look, I want to talk about your observation, Zach. What price of carbon would it take to have an effect? But first of all, I want to comment on Bill Rees's observation. I've worked for 3 parts of the Canadian government and an industry association, and I would observe that governmental thinking has been done for as long as I've been watching, rooted in 2 primary disciplines, law and economics. There's been no real room for science, natural sciences, except in very brief spurts. But on the other hand, a politician in government can't be just a specialist. Successful politicians are generalists. Otherwise, and that's a problem with our current Senate, where many of the recent appointees have come in as specialists and aren't looking at the broad range of issues a government has to look at. Why economics is such a dominant force, I've no idea, but it, in a sense, comes back to the way that the electorate looks at politics. But let me just, can I show you a picture, Zach?
I don't see why you can't, but you'd have to hold it up to your camera.
No, I'm gonna
Oh.
share a.
Oh, that worked. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
I've lost it because I've got too much goddamn stuff open.
Price at the pump, New Brunswick. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just an example. All right. This is the price over 10 years. And I got equivalent graphs for every province and for Canada as a whole. But this one is kind of special, and this is why I've used it. You can see that the price of gasoline goes up and down constantly. It's a bit like a roller coaster. Sometimes you have a precipitous drop, and most of the time it's just going like this. Now, just think about I want to show you what happened. Can you see Trudeau's carbon tax imposed on April the 1st last year in this graph. I've helped you because I put it's here, and I just taken a few weeks out to show you what happened. And I'm afraid my graph has got a bit messed around. In those few days, the price went up and down by that amount. All right. The Trudeau tax imposed was that little step there, not even all of it. So it's pretty clear to me that the carbon tax, which is stated to be the pillar of the federal government's programs, there are other things, but this is its pillar. A pillar of that size isn't going to do anything in the course of a few weeks, and certainly not if you come back out of here. Notice this picture's got messed up a bit. It should look like that.
Maybe we should.
So the answer is, but let me just also tell you that the United States Energy Information Administration has a vast body of data on energy, much more than Canada, and the USEIA has studied the price elasticity of gasoline, retail gasoline. There's more to it than that, but just retail gasoline, the price elasticity, which you never hear, an economic concept, but you never hear a proponent or a government official or a politician talk about price elasticity, but it's in the United States, and it's probably the same here, it's 0.02 to 0.04, depending where you are. Now, that means that the price has to increase by 50% to make the slightest. It means that the price changes are irrelevant. People, and in the chat, I wrote down a short letter in the Vancouver Sun. People, let's get real. Let's get real about why people drive their cars. People drive their cars because cars are fantastic. They're personal mobility devices. You get privacy, you can carry stuff. They're too goddamn useful. We find somewhere else in our budgets. So the carbon tax is a totally irrelevant measure. Our government is planning to get it up to about 130 cents a litre in 1930. If they were confident that this was going to do something, surely they'd put it on much more quickly. And
John, do you have a question?
Yeah.
No, I'm making a point.
No,
So
John,
I'm answering
sorry.
Zach's question.
Okay, could I just respond to that?
We really have to go on with questions for our speaker.
Okay, but Zach, can I respond to that?
Sure.
Okay, no, but I'm not convinced carbon taxes are irrelevant. It depends on the level. The level in Canada, you're probably right that the carbon tax is at its low level, and especially if it's all given back the way it is. But carbon taxes have two functions. One is to reduce the use of fossil fuels, but the second is to raise money for adaptation and mitigation and everything else that needs to be done. And I think carbon taxes, it has to be more than tokenism. And if it is more, as in Norway, the example I gave, I think there are possibilities to make a real impact. And that's why I don't give up hope that we will be able to solve this momentous problem because of places like Norway, an oil producing country. They have set in a series of institutions that, as I put it, is not perfect, but it's as good as it gets. And even with respect, I wouldn't give up hope because pessimism really is unhelpful, to say the least, that things that we thought were impossible in the past have been changed. Malthus predicted that you wouldn't be able to solve the population problem but people now are more prosperous than they were in Malthus's day. In medieval times, people thought that monarchy was necessary. It was impossible to have a world without monarchy, but yet democracy developed. I think we shouldn't give up hope yet. It's a huge problem we're facing. And I think paying the first, I agree completely with, I've forgotten your name, who said it, that fossil fuels and cars and every fossil fuel powered machine is really useful. That's precisely why it's used. But I still think there is hope that we can develop some ways of basing it on clean energy and having implementing the full cost of fossil fuels in its price is important. But I think the problem is the political one, as Nordhaus said. It's very hard. People don't want to pay high prices. And so it's very hard to get that implemented. And the first stage is, as what I call, getting people to, or disseminating a practical understanding of fossil fuels, to let people know just how harmful they are, that they're not the only one taking a plane. There are 4 billion people every year, and the emissions resulting from that very heavy object put in the sky and powering it, it's causing enormous problems, and people have to become more aware of that. And that's what I'm trying to do, to reframe the whole conversation in terms of disseminating a practical understanding of climate change, because the average person doesn't understand what gigatons mean. It doesn't become relevant to them. But if you can explain things in terms of their plane ride or their car ride or their cruise, how many emissions does that involve? Are they going to be accumulating in the atmosphere, and it's their grandchildren that are going to have to pay the environmental debt that's accumulating? It would seem to me that those are necessary conditions for dealing with the climate problem, although I'm not sure they're sufficient conditions.
I'm going to go, I think I should, I don't know either. I think I should go to Mike Nickerson and then John Legg. Peter McKinnon's question, I think, has been addressed already. So Mike Nickerson, then John Legg.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for your expose of where the problems are with fuel use. Mentioned carbon taxes, discouraging people, understanding the problem, all those things, as getting people to become less consumptive of fossil fuels. I'm working on a project where we're saying, well, let's look at what we can do with life that doesn't involve fossil fuels, relating with people, learning stuff, sport, music, dance. You're a sociologist. Where do you see that sort of encouragement of human culture as a replacement? We should be having so much satisfaction from living, we don't have time to consume at a dangerous level. What would you comment?
No, but I agree with you completely. I think that certainly should be part of the solution, but I'm a little bit pessimistic that you can get the world's population doing that and abstaining from the use of fossil fuels, use of cars and cruises and planes, and because they find those things useful, as other people have said. And so I think I think we really have to go the way you suggested, try to get people to enjoy other things. But still, I don't think that will be the sole solution of the problem. You cannot, as I said, ecological saints don't usually work, because they're not numerous enough.
I wouldn't say it's a full solution, but it doesn't get mentioned.
Okay, no, it certainly should be mentioned. I agree with you completely.
And one of the problems is that you can enjoy yourself, but there's no money to be made, so it can't be advertised. So somehow maybe some of the carbon offset money can go to encouraging quality of life.
Okay, sure, I agree. Fine, yeah.
I'm going to John Legg and then John Meyer. John Legg.
Yep, thanks, Zach. Dr. Murphy, that was absolutely fantastic. You, compared to your objectives, I think you have attained them completely. Now, the problem is, and I think this is maybe an unrealistic question and certainly unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. And that is, how does one attack this question at an international level? I mean, I remember working at the UN, negotiating in the arms control and disarmament area. And in the end, what we all seemed to do was to use these negotiations as propaganda affairs, you know, where the Soviet Union usually came out better because they could lie, and we were constrained by democratic principles. I don't really see how one attacks this question at more than a national level. So my first question is to you, and I guess the second one is just to tie you down a little bit about your last book and whether or not there is another one. I think you mentioned that, but maybe not. So there are the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree that it's a global problem. It's an international problem, so it has to have a global solution. You can't have one country that becomes, as I mentioned, ecological saint, and then everybody else in the world keeps polluting. But I wouldn't give up hope. There are, like the person, I think it's Vic Buxton, talked about the Montreal Protocol for the ozone layer depletion. That has been pretty well solved. But let me just add one other thing that I mentioned in my book, and if Vic certainly knows more about that than I do. It's called the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol, as you know, phased out CFCs and HCFCs, which were depleting the ozone layer. But they were replaced by a new innovation, HFCs, that did not replace the ozone layer, but they were 1,000 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So what was done in Kigali in 2016, 170 countries joined together and amended the Montreal Protocol to start phasing out HFCs, first in rich countries by 2019, in low-income countries by 2024, financed by rich countries, and trade sanctions were used to enforce compliance. And subsequently, replacement chemicals were innovated for sort of refrigeration and air conditioning were not affected. And I think that provides us with a possible template for ways to follow on the international level. And once again, I'm sure Vic knows more about this than I do. So if he wants to join the discussion, great.
Well, I'm going to just jump in here and say, we've got John Meyer and Meg Sears. So if Vic wanted to say one very fast thing, okay. But otherwise, Meg, you're going to have the last question, and John, you're up next.
Okay, Vic coming on, or I'm on? I'll go.
Well, did Vic want to say something?
Yeah, okay, Vic, no, yes?
Okay, John, you're up.
Okay, my question is, a lot of the consumption, a good part of the consumption that northern countries do is due to our northern location and the high populations that we've built up in our extreme climates has been due to fossil fuels. The dense energy and the storage characteristics allow us to live up here in comfort and get through the seasonal energy deficit of winter. And it's very difficult to get around that with renewables. And I think we need to recognize that not only do we drive big trucks, go on cruises and fly places, but inherently northern societies will use more energy because of climate and because of distance to resources. If you compare an individual living in Guadalajara, Mexico, to someone living in Inuvik, the person at Guadalajara has everything virtually within walking distance: food, timber. They have a much lower need. They have no need for heating. They have much lower need for clothing. And it's just an inherently lower material and energy consumption, lifestyle, and place to live. So that's basically the question. Have you looked at latitude as a modulator for consumption?
Yeah, I didn't look at that, but I think it's a complex issue because I lived in Quebec before moving to Ontario, just across the river, Gatineau, then to Ottawa. And there in Quebec, hydroelectricity provides an awful lot of electricity, and it provides heating in winter. And we had this, Hydro-Quebec had something whereby we would use electricity to extract heat even from the cold air with a heat pump until it hit, I've forgotten what it is, minus 10 degrees Celsius. It was very cold. And then it was an oil furnace that would switch on automatically. And that was so that Hydro-Quebec could control its peak usage. And they had a way, I think, of centralized control, so that if there was some other reason why there was a peak usage, they could switch us over to oil very quickly. But I'm just saying that the result of that is that in Quebec, a cold climate, most of the heat was provided by hydroelectricity. Also, I think I heard that in Ontario, the peak usage is not heat in winter, it's air conditioning in summer, even in Ontario, and that's a pretty northern latitude as well. So,
Yeah,
and I suspect that in Norway and other Scandinavian countries, very cold countries, that has been dealt with by developing non-fossil fuel energy more than other countries. And also nowadays, the big development in population is in southern climates, and southern climates are very hot. And the result is the demand for electricity is huge because of the demand for air conditioning. That has transformed southern climates enormously. So there's a big demand for electricity that often is provided by fossil fuels, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, it's a large topic. Anyway, thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay, Meg Sears, and you've got the last word. And then it's going to be over to you, Art.
Wow, that's a big responsibility to have the last word. Always what I wanted. No, not really. But there's always this temptation to say, well, we have a better way to produce electricity, so we're just going to have more electricity and more, bigger houses, and we'll just electrify everything. This is the kind of the ladder. We've gone from coal to oil to gas, and now we're going to electrify everything as if there's this infinite supply of electricity, which of course there isn't. And in Quebec, they have a lot of hydropower, and then now they're saying, well, we're going to, use that to make hydrogen, which will make steel and concrete, et cetera. So we have this kind of never-ending cascade of technologies, but we always come up against this wall that, there's inefficiencies and there's excess that we just can't deal with. And as far as I can make out, we're not going to solve our problems with technology. We're going to have to be reducing. And that's where we hit the wall sociologically, et cetera, et cetera. And even nuclear, I think Bob Bosson probably said it best. It's like building an outhouse without digging a hole. We still don't have a solution for that waste. And yet, and that's not going to be the end of our problems either, because you're absolutely right. They're always late, and many times the original price. So I think that somehow or other, we really as a society have to focus on, small is better and so on. And it certainly, I think I'm speaking because I put in the comments that I knew that we were not completely on the right track when Biden was showing this nice green machine, this nice green cars that they're going to be building. So I went for a ride in one, and it was a green Hummer. Somehow we've lost the track of the message here.
Yeah.
So and when you come to conservation, small things count. You know, it's the leaks around the windows, it's the construction, it's the building code. There's a million things that contribute to conservation and, you know, staying comfortable in cold weather. So, you know, at some point we're just going to have to really come to grips with a lot of the details that people are going to have to buy into. Not only smaller green cars, but also the costs and so on of better buildings and so on. It's and along with that is going to have to be some kind of disillusionment about the allure of, you know, the latest iPhone, the latest streaming service or whatever, because we don't really need those.
But I agree with you completely. That's why I put forward as the title of my presentation, we're on a treadmill. You know, we're consuming fossil fuels on a treadmill, but it's really hard to get off of that too, because, you know, to reduce poverty in poor countries, and there's an awful lot of poor people around the world, just to bring them up a slight amount, it's, you know, you need energy. And like even in South Africa, I quote one thing in my book where the South African environment minister was saying, look, we need to electrify the countryside because there's so many people in our country that simply don't have electricity. And I would love to do this with wind and solar energy, but I need it quickly. And he decided that he gets a subsidy from the World Bank using a coal-fired electricity generation. So it's a big problem because in poor parts of the world, electricity is necessary and they don't have it. You know, they don't have air conditioning, they don't have anything with electricity. So it's one thing for us in wealthy countries to cut down our consumption of fossil fuels, and we have to do that to allow place for poor countries to increase theirs, but it's at the same time to base it on clean energy rather than something that's going to hurt our grandchildren, as I try to express it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is absolutely a wicked problem. And I think that every person who is as privileged as we are, who has that capacity to be not only making those choices, but supporting all of these new industries and so on, and really demonstrating, like art has, art's pretty inspiring this way, you know, much better ways of doing things. We can't we have to leapfrog over some of the incrementalism and go to something different and boldly. And I don't think that nuclear power is a good option there.
Yeah.
But
I'm going to leap over there and say, if you know a better option than nuclear power, send it to me, but send it to me privately, because I think we've gone way over the time that Art allotted for the recorded session. Art, your turn.
All right. I think it's very important that we all understand that we've been through this series of Zoom talks, been addressing climate change from its many dimensions. And of course, the talk today, you know, certainly puts this in a package which is quite easy to understand. And some of that data, and particularly relating the amount of carbon dioxide released to the weight of the passenger, is I think is just brilliant. I like that. It's certainly something I shall use when talking with other folks. Anyway, with regards to this, Ray, I'm really delighted that you agreed to talk to us, and clearly by the questions you can tell that there's an awful lot of interest. There were some people, of course, who've been disappointed because they're still in the queue. But if you stick around, we'll see if maybe some of them can get at you. But in the meantime, for those attendees or those who are watching this on YouTube, by all means, if you are interested in joining the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, you can get a hold of us at our website at canadiancor.com. And it is, there's a membership menu item there. Further, we do suggest to everyone that you join our Stay Informed, which is a weekly email which we tell you all the things that have been put up on our website through the week. And clearly every week there's always new material, lots of it. I do point out that the Canadian Association for Clemerome is a registered Canadian charity, and you will get a tax receipt for any membership fees, and we do welcome donations as well. And just like to point out finally as well, that YouTube watchers can in fact become subscribers to our channel. And so you will be the first to know when we post the next talk to YouTube, and that normally happens by sometime on Wednesday evening. So with that, I would like to terminate this recording. Do you want to have one last word, Ray?
No, I just want to thank KCOR for inviting me. And then I've found the discussion after very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to more of it.